G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and so far that you are having a fantastic week. Now, wow, I know as always we say there's a lot to go over, but today there is a lot. There's been, of course, major escalations in what Trump has said about Zelensky. So that is going to be the main part of the video. And we need to go over what Trump has said, what we can take away from that, what Zelensky has said, what Europe is saying, what the steps forward are from here, how this may then affect the battlefield, not only from military aid, but also psychologically, but how that may affect the EU, NATO, Western hegemony, all of that. We've got, of course, a lot to go over in that. And I tell you right here and now, Zelensky may be 3 centimeters taller than myself and a hell of a lot more wealthy, but there's no one I sure as hell would not like to be in his position at the moment. So we're going to go over in that too. What steps should Kyiv take from here forwards? We're going to then look at the maps. We're going to look at another statement that Zelensky made about running out of Patriot missiles, and then look at some footage of strikes 2. And then we need to look at a warning from Russia's international intelligence or security of the SVR. We need to look at a warning they have said about terrorist attacks. We need to look at this. We need to look at, is this on real information? Is this false flag? Is this double false flag? Reverse false flag? We're going to look at all of that. And like I said, the nearer to the end of the war, the more messy and more foggy it is going to become. So, look, let's start with what President of the US, Mr. Donald Trump, has posted on his Truth Social, and then this carried across, of course, onto his Twitter, and then was reshared by many. Now, what I will say, Trump will either go down in history as the leader that betrayed Ukraine or the leader that saved Ukraine. We'll go over it and we'll talk about it and break it down. Think of it. A modestly successful comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky, talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be won, that never had to start, but a war that he, without the US and Trump, will never be able to settle. The United States has spent $200 billion more than Europe, and Europe's money is guaranteed, while the United States will get nothing back. Why didn't sleepy Joe Biden demand equalisation, in that this war is far more important to Europe than it is to us? We have a big, beautiful ocean as separation. On top of this, Zelensky admits that half of the money we sent him is missing. He refuses to have elections, is very low in Ukrainian polls, and the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. A dictator without elections. That is strongly, strongly worded. The president of the most powerful economy and military in the world is calling an ally's president a dictator. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia. So he has doubled down, confirmed that the US and Russia, they are negotiating an end without anyone else. Something all admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do. And we do know this, that Russia and Ukraine have both said that the only ones who can bring an end to this war, although, of course, they have vastly different ideals for the end of the war, they have both said the US is the only one that can do this. Biden never tried. Europe has failed to bring peace. And Zelensky probably wants to keep the gravy train going. I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job and his country is shattered and millions have unnecessarily died. And so it continues. And I believe what Trump is getting at in some of this at this point in time, with millions have died, a war that is unwinnable without the US and they can't settle, is this quote that I shared the other day, that when a commander orders his men into battle, he knows they cannot win. He ceases to be a leader and becomes their executioner. So Trump, again, he's reiterating again and again these figures of $350 billion, $200 billion more than Europe. So where are we getting these figures from? And I want to break this down a little bit. Now, there are, I think, a couple of ways to look at this, but firstly, looking at that. Now, firstly, number one, first way of looking at this is, as per Zelensky's statements, Trump is living in a disinformation space created by Russia. So that's, I guess, option number one. Option number two, I think was best worded by a gentleman on my Telegram by the name of Ross. He says, I wonder if Trump's new access to American intelligence, as well as maybe intelligence that Putin has shared during meetings, of course with a grain of salt, but new access to, of course, behind the scenes US intelligence, maybe intelligence being sent across from the Russians, has this opened his eyes to how serious the Ukrainian position really is? More weapons are pointless if you don't have the soldiers to fire them at the enemy. So has Trump fallen into a disinformation space created by Russia with some of these claims as being claimed by many, or, as per Ross has said, that no, now he's actually had access to classified information that will not be released, he's gone, we need to bring an end to this as soon as possible. And can it be a bit of column A, column B? It can potentially be that as well. But what did Zelensky actually say about Trump? Speaking to reporters in Kyiv, Zelensky pushed back on several unfounded claims by the US president made on Tuesday, while reinforcing Ukraine's position that a deal to end the war needs its involvement. He has said, unfortunately, President Trump, I have great respect for him as a leader of a nation that we have great respect for. The American people always support us. Unfortunately, lives in this disinformation space. So saying that Trump lives in this disinformation space, again, very heavily worded. I'm going to add some context in a bit. My rebuttal, though, to Ukraine's position is that the end of the war needs their involvement. My rebuttal to this would be that I think the US's position on negotiations is that those who are interested in peace negotiations, like peace, guns falling silent now, real negotiations to end the war, that they are welcome. But the way I see it is that Ukraine and the European Union, at least the majority of the European Union, they are not interested in a conversation right now that makes the guns fall silent, given the realities of the situation. They want to have a meeting that they will cloud as a Swiss peace meeting. They'll call it a peace summit, but it won't be. It will be a meeting to try and get Ukraine into a position of power for then a sovereignty of the land and independence inside of NATO. So what I say is there's like two positions that they will claim we're not involved in this, but I'll say, but where people are starting in this, the US is involving really serious who wants to end right now. And that meeting in Saudi Arabia, at least by the US, they said that the Russians really do want to end it. And I just don't see that the other countries are actually willing to come to a meeting where at the end of it, they go, the guns are falling silent, but it's not very favourable. JD Vance has said this, and this was in a Daily Mail exclusive, saying that bad-mouthing Trump in public would only backfire, of course, after the comments made about disinformation space. Vance saying the idea that Zelensky is going to change the president's mind by bad-mouthing him in public media. Everyone who knows the president will tell you that is an atrocious way to deal with this administration. Now, I once shared from an official who, of course, will not be named, but what he said is Russia negotiate with power, Ukraine negotiate with guilt. And Russia has a lot more power than we do guilt. And that's different ways of pushing on global politics. And I think that was very, very interesting to see from his perspective. Now, before we go into potential fallouts of this, I want to sort of put on some lenses and how we should maybe be looking at this. Now, you can't look at this decision that Trump has made through the lens of what is best for my country, what is the best for Europe if you live outside of the US. You can't look at it through this lens. That's not how Trump is viewing things. Trump is viewing things as what is the best for America and exclusively America. Is maintaining a hybrid democracy in Europe, so Ukraine, and spending, by the end of this, would have to be trillions of dollars to gamble on the return of land and gambling potential future escalation, is maintaining that or building relations with a country that holds trillions of dollars of vital resources that people need into the future with global climate shifting and the availability of those, that country with those trillions and trillions in that and strategic, they're moving closer and closer towards the largest threat to the US since the USSR. Of course, moving towards China, and China's happy to take Russia into its orbit. So this is the lens, and I'm not saying this is moral, I'm not saying it's ethical, but I'm saying for where Trump views what is best exclusively for America, no one else, is sacrificing Ukraine's ambition to join NATO and 20% of the land, or pulling Russia back into some level of orbit, trade with those trillions of dollars of vital and strategically important resources while pulling them away to the US's greatest threat, of course, China. That is the lens, that is the calculus that Trump is having, I believe. And Trump's calculus, it doesn't need to be what makes birds chirp and children laugh. His calculus is based on moving the US forward. Now, Estonia, they can criticise this all they want, but they are not in the same position that the US is and doesn't have to consider the same pieces that they do of the puzzle as well. And what I'll say is you can call Trump all you want, but you should also ask, why is Europe not willing to do anything without the US? We see Keir Starmer, we see Scholz, we see Macron make statements and this and that, but all those statements, they have an annex of with US support. And what I'll say is if you can't operate independently, then you are not sovereign. You're a vassal state for the US. Now, that may be rich coming from an Australian, but I understand our position realistically as well. So let's go into this and things to consider. And this is important. And from a former soldier, this should not be underestimated. Do not underestimate the psychological impact this decision can and will have on soldiers at the front line. Those who are being mobilised, physically dragged off the street, and those looking to be recruited. The situation at the front line is already dire. There is already a manpower crisis. There already is a recruitment crisis. And without further US support and US pulling out, do not underestimate the psychological impact of that, given the cost that these guys have had personally and on their friends and comrades as well. Don't underestimate what we could see happen in platoons, companies, battalions at the front line, where we know there's already issues, and that will exacerbate any of this. Also, consider the anti-US rhetoric and messaging through Ukraine and the pro-Ukrainian community online. These can have lasting effects, influence regimes and command decisions. Now putting many people putting that Trump is now an enemy to the state of Ukraine. The impact and division that this can cause within the European Union. The European Union, at least on the whole, put all their chips into this support. And they could be left, quote, holding the bag. And as we know, the closer to an end of a war, in protracted attritional war, people look to recover sunken costs, and we'll read a piece on this. Also, do not underestimate the potential internal instability due to an unfavourable ending. There's real risk of coups and mass emigration as well. These are things we need to consider. It's not a crystal ball saying it will, but we do need to consider this. Now, there's a few points on there I want to talk through. Remember, podcast with this gentleman coming in a few days where we break down this book. We break down protracted war with China. We break down recovery of the Russian forces and what Ukraine and Russia, what they have both done well and what they have done poorly throughout this war. But we need to look over this. That war termination is rendered all the more elusive by the desire to honour sunk costs and by the resultant escalation of commitments, serving to justify earlier military investments and sacrifices. The greater the enemy's effort and costs in fighting for a war, the more he will become committed to his own conditions for peace, thus rendering the prospect of any mutually acceptable resolution all the more difficult. As increasingly frustrated and vengeful antagonists progressively jettison their self-imposed operational restrictions and moral reservations. And in this, he gives the example of during the Second World War, despite some countries' prior moral qualms, all parties engaged in unrestricted submarine warfare and mass aerial bombardment of civilian targets. So as this draws closer, it gets more and more brutal as well. In short, the longer a conflict lasts, the harder it is to bring it to a mutually satisfactory and decisive close. Now, we see, of course, this tension between Zelensky and Trump, and this is what we have broken down before about viewing the war through certain different lenses as well. That whether surrender leads to territorial loss, diplomatic subjugation, or merely a suite of humiliating concessions, its effects can often be likened to an invisible but devastating bow wave, profoundly reshaping the nation's collective psyche and, in doing so, its internal politics. The release of these pent-up pressures and thus led to regime change gives the example of Germany. But he talks about the bitterness of defeat can form the dank loam within which populist extremists or conspiratorial movements then flourish. That for the losers of protracted conflict, the creation of a new narrative or mythology justifying their defeat is more than a mere neurotic fiction of the imagination, providing a shield against the unbearable reality, a reality unbearable to the psyche. Give some examples there as well. And that is stuff we need to take into account of when we are observing what is happening in this conflict. Of course, what we have seen as well is Musk, of course, very close to President Trump, and of course the head of Doge is Zelensky cannot claim to represent the will of the people of Ukraine unless he restores freedom of the press and stops cancelling elections. So the US, big on elections. Now, how does he respond to this from what Trump has said? He needs to respond in some way. So, does he double down? Does he double down and say that the US, the leader of the free world, is compromised by Russian disinformation? Does he then refute these claims? No, this isn't true. This isn't how it is. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Does he, make peace with Trump and the US? Does he swallow his pride and, say that you are correct and hold elections? How does this happen? This is very, very difficult. These are where I see the responses have to be at this point. Now, European Union countries, they may have to choose between Ukraine or the US. That'll either end poorly or really poorly. I can say right now in Kyiv, it would be chaos between Zelensky and his advisors of what is the correct next step to take. Now, I want to look over this of Olaf Scholz. Now, Olaf might not actually be the Chancellor for much longer because, of course, on the 23rd of February, the next day, of course, will be 3-year anniversary of the war, leading into the 4th year. Of course, we have elections in Germany with the AfD party currently in second place. Now, polls, in my opinion, at the end of the day, they mean nothing. We saw this with the US elections, we've seen it with other elections. But if they were to get up, this would be catastrophic for Ukraine and European anti-Russian sanctions as well. Germany is the power in that area of the world. But if AfD win, I believe the European Union will pull a Calin Georgescu. Of course, what we saw happen in Romania, they will cite Elon Musk, I believe, as election interference, and they'll find some Russian interference, I'm sure, somewhere. But Chancellor Olaf Scholz has taken to Twitter to say this about the situation with Volodymyr Zelensky and Trump. Ukraine has been defending itself against a merciless Russian war of aggression for almost 3 years, day after day, and it is simply wrong and dangerous to deny President Zelensky democratic legitimacy. It is true, Volodymyr Zelensky is the elected leader of the state of Ukraine. The fact that regular elections cannot be held in the middle of a war is in line with the requirements of the Ukrainian constitution and electoral laws. No one should claim otherwise. But one thing I will say about martial law is there is, look at states right now. You've got, democratic capitalist states and authoritarian states. Now, what are the pros in wartime of a more authoritarian vertical structure? You have less people pushing back on you. You can get things done more quickly. And we know at wartime, that more authoritarian structure, that's why martial law exists. And you've got power to just say, X factory, you are now producing this, or you are going to there. So what I say is that no, at this point in time, Ukraine is not democratic. Zelensky was elected into power. Martial law puts the pause on hybrid democracy to begin with. They put the pause on that hybrid democracy for the pros that come with the more authoritarian structure in the government in wartime. We would do the same thing. But this is funny to see that Scholz, he's pushing back against Trump here. Now, Ukraine's constitution, it provides the legal framework to not hold elections under martial law, although it is very complex. Now, the issue is, though, here that two of the three parties, Russia and the US, so the two major of the three parties, the third, of course, being Ukraine mixed with Europe, but two of the three parties involved in this believe Zelensky to be illegitimate. Trump and Putin, they both believe that Zelensky is illegitimate, and Trump, well, he spelled it out in this. He called him a dictator, which is a huge problem. If Russia's working the intermediary, if America's working as the intermediary, you've got Russia and both agreeing that he's illegitimate, how do you come to any sort of actual deal there? So I see that Zelensky here has really two options. Firstly, you have elections. To have an election, from my reading, he would have to lift martial law. This, of course, comes with the risk of losing his executive powers during wartime and what may need to be changed there, as well as it risks a mass exodus of anyone who's 18 to 60 who hasn't yet been nabbed off the street. They will just fucking leave if martial law is lifted. Or the Verkhovna Rada, of course, Ukraine's parliament, they can amend the law of Ukraine on the legal regime of martial law to allow for elections to be held under martial law. So this is how it can actually have an election if he needs to. So it definitely can be done. It's not impossible. You just have to make an amendment. 2, you refuse elections. America and Russia will both see you. Russia already sees you illegitimate, don't worry about that. But the US see you as illegitimate, so all that further support is gone. Negotiations with US acting as intermediary are gone. US and Russia will continue, and they will then do their bipartisan deals on whatever, so probably that will benefit Russia's economy greatly. You refuse and rely on European support. He's backed into a corner here. It's very, very tough of what the correct decision moving forward would be. But what I have said is psychological impact for the soldiers at the front line. I would be looking to do this faster rather than slower, because the longer this goes on, the limbo period is going to get worse and worse and worse for the already morale, psychological impact of these guys at the front line, and you could potentially see a legitimate collapse on the front line and mass exodus of people. And we see this as well, that this is all interrelated. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Ukraine's air defense forces are running out of missiles for its US-made Patriot systems. He said that at 3, 4, 5 a.m, the commanders, they called me and said, we're near X city, doesn't tell you which one, and we have no missiles for the Patriot systems. We've exhausted them. There are 8 Russian missiles coming, but we have nothing left to intercept them. And of course, tensions with the US, they are not going to help more Patriot missiles flow into Ukraine, nor is it going to allow Ukraine to get the license to build those weapon systems either. So at this point, I'd expect more hits like this. What will we see Zelensky do? What will we see Trump? Again, very, very difficult. And overnight, we have seen, and there's multiple of this, we've seen like this. This is from Odessa, showing multiple strikes of Russian missiles on some target in here. So it's a terrible and very, very difficult situation at the moment. What will become of it? I don't know. I still think the US has a lot more arm twisting power than people on Twitter or Telegram would like to think, especially into Europe. And we see this because, well, Europe is not prepared to do anything without the US. So I question when people claim their own independent sovereignty as well, above just domestic issues. So let's have a look at the maps. Of course, here we have Ukraine in the center of the screen, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupy since 22, purple since 2014. 14. Now, I expect to see the Russians push pretty hard because it's looking like anything that they can get, they are going to keep, if not more. So we see a lot of red check on this map, and what that red check is showing is that red check is showing ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. Of course, the blue is gains over the past 2 weeks by the Ukrainian forces. Now, Kursk in the Kursk pocket, turned Dashny pocket, now the Konstantinopel pocket. Of course, the grey zone has moved up in here. I believe all this grey zone is actually red at the moment. I think we'll see that update tomorrow in the next couple of days. Remember, all the other maps are showing this. But of course, there has been another pocket formed in Constantinople, as this red check on this map here shows today. And I do believe I have a map here. Yes, this is the Syriac maps. Now, of course, here's showing, let's move this across because it can be a little bit more difficult to see. Constantinople here. This is Ulaki, closed up through the grey zone area. We know definitely a northern push. Both maps are showing this, and push into Constantinople. So we know that to be true. Now, of course, Andriivki up here has changed its formation dramatically of how it looks, but at this point in time, I'd say the majority of that is under occupation, as well as that pocket starts to really fall apart. And there's still questions around how many ended up in this pocket. Now let's move our way down to the west of here. Of course, we have then Velyka Novosilka, still not confirmed to be lost by many bloggers. We have Novosilka has come under control by the Russian forces on the western side. And of course, more pushes in the direction of Skudny as well. Now, let's bring this up here and we can confirm this. 100% same directions here. We can confirm that that is what has occurred. Now, let's move our way up the map, and we'll move, of course, this is then into Pishani on the western side of Pokrovsk. I believe I have a Pokrovsk West. Yes, we see then around the Kotleni, there has been some movement as well. They never really showed the full movement back into Pishani. Remember, Pishani was recaptured by the Ukrainian forces. We showed you that geolocation down in here the other day, and now this map is showing that that is pushing back. Now, on the eastern side, we see some red check, but we also see that this very, very important intersection has been recaptured by the Ukrainian armed forces. Now, this intersection does not mean at the moment cars are going to be rolling down that. It's still incredibly, incredibly close to the front line, but there has been a pushback to retake this, but also filling in this position here. And that Syria confirms the Ukrainian army recaptured the level crossing here. So that has come back under Ukrainian control if the Ukrainians can push this back, because at the moment this is still strategically cut off because it's too close. If they can push them back out of range artillery, and or at this point you're in light arms range, we will see on what happens here. But they have leveled up their front line in here. The Russian forces have leveled this, so we could see a counter push back into here to get into a more opportune area. Now, Toretsk in here, we actually have a bit of an update from Syriac on the real situation in here. Now, again, this is difficult to see, but it does say there was a Ukrainian push. It's in line with these two quarry spoil piles in here, so right up in this area, that Ukrainian army counterattacked and recaptured a series of positions in here. But Toretsk, we spoke about this yesterday or the day before, of is this occupied? And Syriac has clarified this. The battle for Toretsk is not over. While the Russian Ministry of Defense declared the capture of the city, the fighting continues on the immediate outskirts. It is true the urban area can be said to be under Russian control, but not so some Telecon and adjacent trenches from where the Ukrainian forces are trying to infiltrate back to the first buildings. So some of these spoils and some of the immediate trenches are still under Ukrainian control. At the moment, there's been no attempt to expand the perimeter around Toretsk by Russian army, despite unconfirmed reports in recent days. So we will see what happens here. Now, this in Klishkivka and Rivkia area is a major update of some 2.5 kilometers, of course, in the Bakhmut area to the south of Chasiv Yar. Now, this is not a new update at all. Most other maps, including other Ukrainian maps, are showing that it's right down to here. And I've seen some claiming that it's now been 12 months where this should have been shown for a 5-kilometer advancement. But this is starting to catch up and drip feed in some of these updates as well. Now, move our way up, and then we have the Terni front and, of course, Yampalivkia in here. Open this Syriac map, and it shows Russian army retook full control over the locality of Yampolivka, so Yampolivka here, and continued surrounding the forest area to the east of it. So if we zoom in on this, what we're looking at is, we see it is Yampolivka, where this crossing is, so right in this sector in here, and underneath the forest belt in here. So here and here, judging off where Syriac is saying and looking at where my cursor was. We have the Pishani front, Kryilivka front up in here, of course, breakthrough to the Oskil, which has caused a lot of issues. Now, Russian army made a small advance south of Lozova. This is Lozova right in here. So just to the south of here, we see where these two tree lines are. So just in this sector here somewhere, close enough. We see this paddock, so just out of here. And then that Ukrainian forces had a push back as well in Zadazove, made new advances north of Zadazove. So Zadazove pushing back into this sector. Map not showing this today, I believe. No, it is not. And I don't believe there's any changes up in Kursk, Suja region. No, there's not. But one thing to take into account, and this is a grain of salt, there are a lot of Russian pages today saying that Russians have claimed not only from Sverdlovskovo to the border, but they've actually crossed the border in this sector. Now, grain of salt, I've seen nothing to prove this, but just wait out on that in case, we'll just put it out there in case we see that occurring. Now, this is another thing we need to put out there. In case it occurs, we can say, hey, we've got sort of an upper hand on trying to analyse what this is. Is it a real attack? Is it false flag? Is this setting groundwork for false flag? Could it be a double false flag? That, of course, then the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, has spoken on their website about a possible Ukrainian terrorist attack in Europe. So, European capitals are alarmed by Ukraine's extreme willingness to reach an agreement with Moscow if this requires excessive concessions. According to the information available to the Europeans, one of those options being considered by the Ukrainian regime for disrupting the negotiations involves carrying out a series of terrorist attacks against Russian diplomatic missions in European countries. Ukraine is most likely to attempt such attacks in Germany, the Baltic states, and Scandinavia. As noted, cooperation between these countries and Russia is at the lowest level in the EU, and contacts between intelligence agencies in the anti-terrorist direction have been virtually curtailed. It is also possible that the Ukrainians will prefer Slovakia and Hungary, since such a choice promises additional benefits. EU members who hold a special position on the Ukrainian conflict will be discredited. The terrorist plans of Kyiv regime are unlikely to surprise anyone today. What is indicative are the cynical conclusions of the European politicians about the need to increase vigilance in order to prevent the undermining of the process of settling the Ukrainian crisis. So to undermine this is what we have seen Slovakia say, that Europe will go to measures to undermine any sort of diplomatic negotiated end of this, of which Europe is quite tired. Not a hint of condemnation for the atrocities planned by the Ukrainians, not a shadow of concern about the threat to the lives of the Russian diplomats. One gets the impression that the experience of the EU members waging a war with Russia to the last Ukrainian has accustomed them to cannibalistic mathematics in which 100 or 2 human victims are a statistically insignificant unit. The terrorism is just a continuation of diplomacy by other means. So, what could this be? Could it be the SVR are releasing real information? Could it be like they are, like this is what could occur? Or could it be laying framework? Just like we saw, I believe, from the GUR, Ukraine's military intelligence, they were releasing a lot of reports, I believe late 23, about imminent Russian attacks on the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and that Russia would try and have that as false flag. Is this laying groundwork in this? Could it be that? Could it be laying intelligence operations to discredit? Could it be real information that Ukraine is trying to bring in NATO? They're trying to get further support in. But at this point in time, a Russian false flag just doesn't make sense. In Russia, it's looking like the US will work with them for a lot of their strategic goals. It's looking like Russia's going to get a lot of what they request. In my opinion, the risk versus reward just doesn't add up. And this is why we have been saying there's always risk of false flags, to discredit, to muddy the waters. But it doesn't make sense for the winning party at this point in time, especially with the deals that could just be out the window now with the US and the risk of NATO getting involved, where on the other side, Ukraine militarily, as Zelensky has stated, does not have the power militarily to take back these areas. Could it be something to draw further in NATO or NATO support? We've spoken about the real risks of this, but we need to speak about some other elements of what this may be. Now, this is the SVR headquarters, or the Yellowstone Ranch has had a massive upgrade. But we need to speak about false flag, double false flag, how this may look. Remember, all of this is deception, laid on deception to manipulate public perception. And this is the hard thing with intelligence agencies, is you don't know when they're laying deception to manipulate public perception of something or lay the groundwork, in layman's talk, or it is real, hey, this is what is about to happen. And even if it then does, it's still deception because people go, well, that's what happened. We saw that very recently too. Now, we need to lay out what these are. A false flag is an operation or event that is designed to deceive by making it appear as though it was carried out by a different party than the actual perpetrators. It is typically used to justify military action, political maneuver, or manipulate public opinion. Perfect example of this is, of course, Nord Stream pipeline. That there is overwhelming evidence that Ukraine, with help of some other states, went in, they exploded the Nord Stream pipeline. The whole world, from Ursula von der Leyen to President Biden, they all blamed it on the Russians at the time that they did it. False flag event. Now, the evidence has come out, especially through Germany's intelligence services, that, hey, it looks like it was the other way. But we also need to take into account a double false flag, or some will say a reverse false flag. This is when the real attacker knows people might suspect a false flag. So they set it up to look like someone else staged the false flag. This adds another layer of deception, of course, muddying the waters even further. For example, a country stages an attack and blames its enemy. Then it leaks fabricated proof that the enemy staged a false flag to frame them. If you're a bit confused, it's meant to be. It's meant to muddy the waters. It is meant to deceive you and really have an impact on then public opinion and further support. This is the most simple of this. False flag, you break a window, but you blame your neighbour. Double false flag, you break a window, you leave your own fingerprints behind on purpose, so when people suspect that it's you, you can say, see, my fingerprints, they're too obvious. It's a setup. Our neighbour actually did it and tried to frame me. For example, I think the best of this could be if it actually was a Russian drone that attacked Chernobyl. It was too obvious. It seemed too obvious. It seemed obviously like a Ukrainian false flag, but may have it been a Russian double. That, to use this analogy, then they have done it, and they said, well, our fingerprints, our drone, it's too obvious. It's a setup. Our neighbour actually did it, Ukraine actually did it, to try and frame us on a false flag. Now, for that exact incident, knowing that the Western media and most of the Western states, bar America, will just eat up whatever they are told, then I don't see the benefit for Russia in that. But, again, it's just worth pointing out, and the reason we bring this up is if we see something happen, that's at the point we've had, time prior to say, right, was it a legitimate action to try and draw in a third, fourth, fifth party into the war? Was it potentially a false flag to discredit? Was it maybe a double false flag to muddy the water, discredit further, and maybe draw the US even further away from Europe? Again, if it's confusing, it's meant to be. Legends. I hope I got everything, didn't I? Yes, I hope that you have a fantastic day. I've got something actually special for you tomorrow that I think you will really, really find interesting, as I definitely did. It's the most based, to use a young person's word, based overview of this war that I have actually read yet. Legends, have a great day. I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.